All right, good morning or evening or night, everybody. Welcome to our group practice for Solo of the Month, sponsored by our friends at Flute World. Thank you, Flute World. Your place for all things flute, including sheet music, accessories, and of course, instruments. So we're glad that they're giving some support to Soul of the Month and our efforts to grow the community through sharing our musical ideas. Today we'll do similar to what we did last month. We'll talk about a topic. And again, I am here just kind of as a host. By no means is this the Matthew show, or do I want to be the only person giving out ideas? But I'm here to host and hopefully keep us all together. Today's topic is going to be talking about expressive vibrato, or what I like to think of as dynamic vibrato, and not loud and soft dynamic, but just like having variety to vibrato. And we'll be applying it to the solo of the month repertoire, which includes the Gobert suite and then the Kohler Berceuse. And I think the Berceuse might be from a suite too, but I'm not sure what that suite is. It's new music to me, like the Gobert is also. So two new pieces for me, which is always fun. That's part of one of the things I love about this group is it keeps challenging me to look at new music as well. So I'd like to open up just with a group conversation of vibrato. And this group practice, I don't want to get stuck on where vibrato is created. I know that the flute community has two seemingly very polarized opinions of where vibrato is made. But I'd like to just go around the room, especially since we're a smaller group right now, and talk about what vibrato is to you. So who would like to just share out what vibrato is? And maybe you talk about where you produce it or how or what you think about, just two or three sentences about your relationship with your vibrato. And if
Oh,
you're muted, you'll need to remember to unmute yourself.
I can go first, comme d'habitude. Um, I used to think of vibrato as this thing that was overlaid on sound, and it was one thing. And I used to think, oh, you have a vibrato, and you know, what I've come to learn is it's a tool, or it's one part of the palette that you have, and accompanying my awareness of that vibrato isn't just this static thing that happens to happen by itself, which was kind of the way I was taught it or taught the concept. I was actually taught the concept, not taught the concept. Like I was taught the concept that it would happen and you just let that happen where it happens. And in this, my revisiting of playing flute in the last 4 or 5 years, I've realized that vibrato is not only a tool in the palette, but it's how to give and add life in places. It's how to, it's basically many things, but it's primarily for me, I think, to add resonance um, when I'm playing. But it's to add something. It's not an organic thing that happens by itself. And conversely, I've become more aware of playing with completely no vibrato as well. So it's like Nick uses, it's a choice and it has variation. And there's lots of different aspects to vibrato. It's just this magical innate thing that happens.
Thank you. All right. Who else can share with their relationship with their vibrato? Lily, before we get you to fall asleep, what is your relationship with your vibrato like? That's what I get for putting someone on the spot.
I think she's muted.
Right. While she looks for that mute button, Joe, what is your relationship with your vibrato?
Well, I come from an Irish traditional music background where um, vibrato is not used. And in fact, in Irish traditional music, the typical flute that's played is called a simple system open hole flute, where in fact what musicians use is shimmering. So you'll see them shimmering their fingers to produce a vibrato type of effect. So on the Bowen flute, um, I've switched to, if you like, playing classical music, but I don't actually have any natural vibrato. And when I listen carefully to all the great flute players, they all have this incredible variety of vibrato. And when I saw it on the topic today, I said, "Oh, I must join in and have a listen to the conversation." I have watched a number of YouTube tutorials, and there's some excellent ones there. Um, there's one which has, I think, a 12-step process for vibrato, which is very, very good. But getting from the exercises to producing it naturally, I'm not sure how to make that leap. So I've started to do some of those exercises, like four ripples, and 5 and 6 and 7 and all that stuff. But I noticed most of the classical musicians seem to do it totally naturally. And from what I've seen, people like James Galway and that, is that he would say, listen to singers. And if you look at a singer up closely, you can see the vibration at the back of the throat. So I'm inclined to believe that it is from up here rather than a diaphragm thing, even though all these exercises are using the diaphragm. So there's a mystery in there for me to be solved. So I'm hoping maybe after an hour today, I might have some clues about what to do next.
Wonderful. And yes, I think vibrato, as far as anatomically, is going to remain a mystery. It's clear that abdominal tissue and abdominal muscles are used. It's clear that there is movement in the throat and different parts of the body. I was speaking with a physician flutist about it, and as far as we see lots of muscle groups moving, but which are being stimulated and which are sympathetically moving, we won't be able to know until we can have brain scans that are fast enough to acknowledge which is being triggered first. So we'll do a few practices that work a couple different aspects of creating vibrato, and then you can just call it what you want. Whatever is moving is whatever you think is moving is good by me. Lily, did you find your mute button? Would you like to share out what vibrato means to you?
Yeah, finally, I pressed the right one. Well, I don't really know how to do vibrato because usually when I play, I just play very straight. I don't really have very good vibrato, but I use my diaphragm and I kind of shake my stomach, but I know that's wrong. And I heard people say don't use the throat, but I'm not sure what they're talking about. So I just want to learn more about vibrato.
Yeah, good. And I like to think that there's more right ways to do things than wrong, generally, as a teacher. And I have had people say, like, well, you can see movement in the throat, but you can't see movement in the abdomen. When I'm doing, depending on the vibrato, when I'm doing intense vibrato, if I were to put my hand just below my sternum, you would see those muscles also moving. You can see movement in my abdominal region when I'm vibrating. So I don't think one's bad as long as there's not discomfort and as long as you like the way it sounds. There's more right ways to do things than wrong. Nick, what's your relationship with your vibrato like?
So my vibrato relationship is very organic in the way that Daniel was talking about, that it sort of derives from like a singer's vibrato, right? And that it's very incorporated into the sound, but also the way that I've studied vibrato with various coaches and teachers throughout the year, I think that it's a real combination between the two places that people are sort of mentioning today, the diaphragm and the abdominal region and the throat, because there are muscles and all of the air goes through the whole column to come out here. So there's no way that we can just isolate one or the other. I really think that it's a true working, lovely relationship dynamic between the two places. And that's where I think you can get a lot of variety in your vibrato. The other way that I sort of think about vibrato is in tandem with sound. It can be just as distinctive to listen to recordings and say, oh, I know that's James Galway because of his vibrato, or I know that's Marina Piccinini because of her vibrato, or whoever you're listening to. People do also in tandem with their sound have a very distinct vibrato. And I think that having that variety is really, really important because, again, as Daniel was saying, in my playing, like I use it to make decisions. in phrasing and in inflection in the phrasing.
I love that. And along those lines too, I remember when I was a sophomore or junior in high school, I, I performed in a competition, and one of the adjudicators said, "Are you a student of Marie?" And I was like, "Yes." And she's like, "I can tell from your vibrato." So not only are there players that have a signature vibrato, but sometimes then they're like their family tree picks up some of those characteristics as well, and they might change and adapt over time. All right, Sean, and last but certainly not least, what is your relationship with your vibrato?
I see it as a musical element, right? An additional signal in the sound that we can control to to deliver our musical idea. So we have a lot of variables we can do with vibrato, and I think it's more important to figure out what you want to do with it than the underlying mechanism of how it's produced. Because we'll never really solve that mystery, not in our lifetime. But if you can figure out how to produce a vibrato, then you can start thinking about how wide you want it to be, or how fast you want it to be, or how you want to shape it for different phrases to, deliver your musical idea.
Wonderful. And I like that you are okay with the mystery remaining, because personally I am too. I know that many of you in like Flute Forum and those other groups have seen me get on my soapbox when somebody posts a video of one person's thoracic scan imaging happening and saying it's been scientifically proven. My only soapbox is the scientific method isn't based on observation of one person, right? It needs to be something bigger than that. So if you've seen that soapbox, I'm not saying it's not produced up here or sometimes produced up here. I'm just saying I don't think we can have a scientific, this is the way, this is the scientific truth, unless we actually follow the scientific method of
Well, or for everyone, right? Because some people might diligently practice diaphragmatic vibrato and figure out a way to make that work.
When I was a kid, my nostrils, and they still do sometimes, my nostrils would flare open and closed whenever I was playing the flute. I'm like, well, I know that my nose isn't making the vibrato, so but it is something that is measurably moving. So I love that you said that we might not never know, and I like that you're okay with it. And hi, Cynthia, thanks for jumping in. All we've done so far is talk about our relationship with our own vibrato. Would you care to share out what vibrato means to you and what you think of when you think of vibrato?
Many years of thinking about it and working on it. I used to, when I first started my college degree many years ago, I had a nanny goat in the throat vibrato, and it reappears every now and again. And yeah, I'd like to feel more comfortable with it and come to a place where I I can control it artistically as well as physically, but I guess I have to control it physically before I can control it artistically.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so interesting and the change since when I was a kid, which was um, it was your vibrato period, like that innate thing that we were talking about, and the notion of, well, you can actually develop different elements or different styles. Yes, you may lean into one way because that's what you were influenced, like the way you were describing with your teacher, Matthew. But learning variety. I guess my problem is with all the other things that I try to work on and do drills on constantly is how important is this and how much time can I afford to spend on it? And I must admit that it's not something that I've really worked on enough to my mind.
Yeah,
Yet.
and
Or yet, as you like to hear me say. I haven't worked on it yet.
not everybody needs to work on the same things and for the same purposes. I teach a lot of students of different ages. Some are adults and some are kiddos, right? And so I have the blessing that I get to do a lot of the basic exercises multiple times throughout the week. And I feel like even as a professional player, it would be good to revisit some of those basics probably more frequently than we do. And so that's what I'd like to go ahead and segue into now is I'd like to cover two of the ways that I notice vibrato being taught to beginners. So if everyone can just think of where their ego is today of like, I have been playing flute for 32 years now. I don't need to review the basics, or I have been playing flute for whatever it is, right? I have been playing flute for 32 years now, but my favorite part of playing the flute of my warm up is reviewing the basics. So I like to start with the way that I was personally taught vibrato. It is not something that developed naturally for me, or maybe it would have if I had played flute longer before I had a teacher say that it's time for you to learn vibrato. And this is the way that I usually start with teaching my beginners. So my viewpoint as a teacher is I first teach what I call abdominal vibrato, or the vibrato that's being initiated lower. And then after they've developed some sense of that movement without having any kind of tension developing in their throat or extra noise, nanny goat sound, then we start talking about other ways. So for me, if you just start with a yawn in and then a yawn out as if you're saying ha, there is contraction down low for this exercise. When it goes really fast, that contraction is going to become more subtle. And when it goes to certain sizes of vibrato, there might be very little movement down here at all. But for now, just feel that openness of the air and the temperature of the air in the back of the mouth and throat without the flute. As flute players, once our flute touches our face, everything changes for no good reason. So I'd like to invite you all to take the barrel of the flute or the head joint that isn't the lip plate, the part that's not going to make any sound, and just touch it to your chin, yawn in, and try the exact same thing. Observations so far. Anything like, whoa, yay, no, yes? Any thoughts? All right, obviously we're not going to have that much force when we're playing the flute. So let's keep the flute shifted, but move into more of an embouchure shape. So we'll yawn in. With that type of shape, it's not sustainable for a line yet, right? But what I want to focus on first is the throat staying open, regardless of what kind of contraction or change of air pressure is happening anywhere else. So the main focus right now is keeping the tongue down and the throat open here. Let's make it a little bit more subtle. Feel okay with everybody? All right, now let's make a sound. So I'm going to finger a B flat because I can do it one-handed pretty easily. I like to do one-handed playing a lot when I'm reviewing basics. And I'm simply going to think quarter note pulses of that open. And I switch to original sound for musicians because that might make a difference. Try it a few times and let me know what you think. So first question, how many of you have experienced a teacher teaching vibrato where you're focused on the abdominal muscles, including the diaphragm? A few of you. How does it feel to you today at 11 a.m. or 11 p.m. or everyone's at different times, right? 8 a.m., 4 p.m. Thumbs up okay? Anybody want to share out their thoughts or their observations so far?
I don't think the way I've learned it with the vibrato or was taught with the vibrato from anybody was like that. It was more about pushing your diaphragm itself as opposed to what you're suggesting. And pushing your diaphragm itself, to me, the way it was demonstrated before, I immediately start to tense my throat.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas what you did keeps the throat open, the awareness of the tongue lower down. So I like the openness of the sound as opposed to the constriction that often happens automatically when one inserts a vibrato.
Right, good. Yes, anybody else?
Um, it's a good way to avoid that sympathetic nanny goat throat sound. I mean, it's just such a natural way to keep the throat open. And I was not explained that before. I mean, I knew I needed to keep the throat open, but doing the yawn and the thrust just naturally makes that happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a really great way, especially for younger learners, because they haven't developed a lot of awareness over their body. The abdominal tissues are muscles that they can identify. So there's 4 layers of abdominal tissue, and the main one that's being activated in this is the transverse layer of abdominal tissues, which kind of wraps around. So that's the tissues that's used in Lamaze, like the which wraps around and gives a gentle, more subtle squeeze. The diaphragm, when engaged, actually shifts down. So what we're not using the diaphragm. The diaphragm, don't get me wrong, the diaphragm is involved. I'm just not asking you to engage the diaphragm, because that would be this way, which isn't what we're quite working on. So the focus is on the abdominal tissues contracting subtly enough to force the diaphragm up a little bit. When we start thinking about contract and force, then tension tends to creep into our imagination. So, I like to just talk about going shh, 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 like a librarian, or like laughing, ha, 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 those kinds of activities. So next, I'd like to invite everybody to do it just a little bit faster. We're not going to go through all the exercises today, but thinking maybe eighth notes. You may or may not decide to put one of your hands on your abdominal region, just below the solar plexus is where it's really happening. If that's comfortable for you, to put just a little bit of pressure for awareness, awesome. Again, the main goal is to keep the throat in that yawn-like shape. If you need to yawn, but every time you take a breath, cool. And then if you want to transition right into it, the next part would be to think triplets. So for me, I was taught a very mechanical way of learning vibrato, and I was taught odd numbers sound more natural. So if I'm playing a phrase with eighth notes, it's going to sound like a machine doing it. So thinking the same thing but with triplets. And that much is simply all that I did with my teacher at the time I learned vibrato. She had me do it with a metronome and be very strict by the time I got to triplets. And then we moved the metronome up subtly over the period of 2 or 3 weeks until we got to 92. And the reason 92 instead of 90 is because you probably all remember, I don't know if Nick remembers or not, but metronomes used to only move in 4s. So my students laugh at me like, what do you mean? And it's like, well, that's just how metronomes were. They went by 4. Or I guess there were digital metronomes that were subtle, or that I actually started off with a slidey metronome that actually tick-tocked back and forth. Anyway, so when we got to 92 was a tempo that the triplets started to sound more natural and that they would connect. So we kept it as short pulses, as fast as 80 even. Etc. And then when we got to 92, it started to naturally become a little bit more smooth and seamed. And then after that much work with the teacher, she just let it kind of go. So what are our thoughts and feelings so far? And that teacher, just because I love to get a shout out, Marie Garretson-Jury at Beamish. I bring her up a lot, and I use several of her last names because depending on what decade you knew her, she might have a different last name. Still probably one of the top 3 most influential flute players I can imagine in life. So if you ever have a chance to work with her, do so.
Where is she?
She's in Florida now, somewhere on the east coast of Florida, not far from Miami. But she's almost always on a jet plane somewhere still.
Would you use that, like, for example, I'm working on the Doppler fantasy. Would you set the metronome and do that in the long tones of something that you're working on? Would you incorporate it that way?
That is a very good question, and actually my third point on my list of things that I want to talk about. Yes and no. So whatever style of vibrato you're going to choose for whatever it is that you're practicing, I think it's good to practice that at all tempos. Last year, probably around this time, maybe a little bit earlier, I had a great opportunity of interviewing Keith Underwood, who was one of the National Flute Association Lifetime Achievement Award winners last year. And with the help of Flute World, thank you, Flute World, I got to interview Keith Underwood. And he talked about how one of his favorite things to do with students is have them listen to a record and slow the record down and count the number of vibrato pulses on each note that the artists in the records that are appealing are doing. And then practice that music with those that exact number of pulses, and then slowly speed the metronome up. So that way, if you wanted a shimmer of vibrato on a 16th note at the top of the run, you would do it slowly enough that you were able to apply the vibrato on that 16th note at the top of the run and begin to slowly speed it up, keeping the same number of quavers on that note. So that is a very precise and mechanical way of approaching music. I definitely think that works for some learners. I actually did not grow up with an incredibly artistic mind. I grew up with a very mathematical mind. And so becoming an artist was, I guess, I did it to spite my family and like what felt more natural to me. They expected I was going to do something math sciencey. But I know that there are learners who like start off with a creative thing and they're like, why do you mean you want me to count to 13 or whatever it is? Like, so I think it all also depends on our learning or overall learning styles, not just flute learning, but overall learning styles. Any other thoughts of that so far?
Yeah, I would also approach it from the other end. Instead of listening to what someone else has done, take something relatively simple, a simple etude that isn't too technical, and figure out how many pulses you can comfortably put on each note. Plan it out ahead and play to that plan. Figure out where your limits are, where too fast is too fast and too slow doesn't do anything.
This is why teachers in general are such a big fan of slow practice. And students often think it's just because they don't think my technique is good enough. But for me, I want a student to play the entire piece where they can use the expressive vibrato, the dynamics, the intonation, the mood, and all of those things. If you're playing something fast and all you can think about is getting through the technique of it, then you're not thinking about those other elements. So slowing it down where you can use the vibrato that you want, the dynamics that you want, the articulation, all of the elements that you want. That's part of the reaching the goal that Sean artistically already had in mind, or wherever it might be. Other thoughts? You're muted, Daniel.
Yeah, I just want to thanks, Sean. That was really interesting. I'm just really excited about doing these things over the next few days. But I just wanted to circle back to your point about, you learn mathematically and therefore you had to challenge yourself. So I always thought that I learned like conceptually and creatively, and that adding the mathematical quotient or the analytical quotient, let's say, was like work, because it wasn't where I naturally. But the truth of the matter is, it's kind of the reverse. I prefer now having the analysis, and I find it liberating. And I think all of us tend to go to where we think we are more comfortable. And I think we can surprise ourselves by going the other way. I know in my case that's happened, and how liberating it can be to get out of what you think you're more comfortable with.
Yeah, and some of those learning styles are actually not just nature, but nurtured into us too. So if you think of the way that we're taught through elementary school, we're usually taught there is an answer and you need to seek the answer versus discover something. So part of it is, K through 12, 13 years of education, and then higher ed, if you go past that, has to do with some of those learning comforts as well. But
also you can be typecast in certain ways. Like as a young gay kid, I was creative, but the truth of the matter is I was really more of an analytical person than I was a creative person. but that's the way society sees us. And then we kind of own that. When anyway, this is getting philosophical, but I think it's all important to look at the way we learn, the way we practice in a 360 way that's outside of our comfort zone.
Yeah, if ever those outside influences become an aha moment in your music, please share that out because that is absolutely true. There's nothing about this class that I want it to be like, this is how you play the flute. I want to be, this is how we connect with each other, connect with ourselves, connect with our instrument, whatever it happens to be. There's so many different ways. And having the acknowledgement of what happened as children influences the way that we are as adults playing the flute. That's very valid and true. So now I want to just quickly talk about another way of approaching vibrato. I know Trudy Kane and some great masters teach vibrato this way, starting off with the core support staying steady and then feeling a release of air pressure happening somewhere between, I don't know, for me it feels like it's between the Adam's apple and not the I don't know, somewhere just in the middle of my rib cage. Does anybody feel this releasing type of vibrato? Is that something that you practice that you might be able to better explain than what I'm doing? So I'm going to start with the core support, and I'll toggle original sound for musicians on. And I'm going to slightly flat by opening here is kind of what I'm imagining happening. Like if this is my air column, I'm imagining ooh, 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 somewhere in here. I can't see it and I can't really feel it because I think it's happening on the other side of my sternum and my rib cage, but I'm not sure. Does that feel natural to anybody that you can explain what it is that you feel or what you notice?
It's like a
Well, when you look
bellows.
at that approach, it's the opposite of the other approach, right? The first approach is we have a tone, we're adding pulses to the tone. This approach is we have tone and we're adding dips to the tone, right? So for people who conceptualize vibrato primarily as pitch variation, then that approach is gonna work more naturally for them.
Sure. The abdominal supported vibrato tends to raise pitch more, but also increase volume. The releasing style of vibrato, there is less dynamic variance, although the volume goes down a little bit, but there's a lot more pitch bend of it going much flatter. And so then a bigger question comes up of which pitch do I center with my tuner, things like that. I don't necessarily want to get into that today. So then with Trudy's approach, and again, this isn't what I was taught, so I'm kind of doing the best I can. She also just goes with speeding it up. So try that if you will for a moment or two, and then share out. And if you are ready to share out because you've already tried it, share out your observations of what that version feels like. And I would love to have Trudy explain it herself. I'm sorry she's not here. I'm not accrediting what I'm teaching to Trudy. Just this is my observation of her teaching and what I took away from my notes of it. So those of you with better or different experience of that style of vibrato, do please describe how you learned it. And now the question becomes, is there an other? Did anybody else practice vibrato in a different way besides either thinking down low or thinking up high?
I think I learned it in a completely different way, and I don't think the way I learned it's that uncommon, and that's because I was a young singer before I was a young flute player. Vibrato seemed to come more naturally when you're singing than when you're trying to mechanically do something on the flute. Mm-hmm. So for me, it transferred over, and then I later had to work to control it rather than trying to figure out how to produce it in the first place.
And where do you notice the vibrato then?
For me, it's primarily in the throat area.
Mm-hmm. Were you not feeling it with the releasing pressure thing?
Yeah, that for whatever reason just doesn't work in my brain.
Mm-hmm. Is there another way that you would teach it to a beginner?
I probably start with the pulse method, but I don't dwell too much on the diaphragm. I think people get a little obsessed with, trying to control that particular muscle that's not all that, dynamic.
I surveyed several singers too, because I also see on flute forums the argument of singers vibrate with their throat, period. If you survey a baritone, they're not gonna, chances are they're gonna say that they feel a vibrato down low, or a bass. So I also don't know that that's a true statement where singers vibrate with their throat. So there are more right ways to do things than wrong. So we get to make artistic choices and have elements. So practicing the control of vibrato can be very useful. I think of vibrato as being three-dimensional. If you can imagine a square, but several of them, like a box, I guess. A box is a three-dimensional version of a square. There's a couple of different things that I like to practice, and whichever method of finding a vibrato I think is useful. The first is speed, and so there's exercises that you can do this just by simply speeding at the metronome, or sometimes I'll set the metronome to, probably more commonly, I'll set the metronome to a pulse, and then I'll do pulses of 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s against whatever the metronome is set at. And some of them might be comfortable and some of them might not. I'm going to try to make the vibrato size and dynamic about the same regardless of how fast I'm doing it. So first, just to demonstrate, I'm going to set the metronome to 72 and show you what I mean. 2s, 3, 4, and 5. And I barely made 5. I don't think I got all of them to be quite 5s. But does that kind of make sense of how the vibrato is changing speed? Try that on your right now. As you change speed, you might notice the vibrato moving to a different part of your body as well. Practicing fast vibrato has a few uses. Sometimes we want, or different speeds of vibrato. Sometimes we want the music to have a lot of passion, and faster vibrato can sound passionate. Or sometimes, as we mentioned before, we might just want a little sparkle of vibrato on a passing 16th note. And if we can only vibrate at a certain speed, we might not have the ability to create movement of sound on a short note. So practicing the speed of vibrato is useful for that. Any observations from you all now that you've tried it?
Yeah, I think it gets more musical the more pulses you put in. So I can see maybe a transition with plenty of practice of getting to that musical effect. Whereas the pulsing slowly, there's nothing musical about that. It's very mechanical.
Mm-hmm.
So I think maybe regular practice with maybe 4 to 7 pulses with the metronome set at 60 or 70 might be a good approach.
Yeah. What other observations? And of course, the caveat of don't vibrate so fast that you are creating tension somewhere else, right? So when I was doing those 5s and I really want to do the 5s, it wasn't working and I was starting to tense. If that's the case, because I'm not ready to do 5s at 72 today, maybe I'm just not warmed up. Maybe I'm not been doing it long enough. You know? Do 1 beat instead of 3 beats, kind of a thing, and then add the number of beats if you want to build the endurance. We're talking muscle systems just like any other athletic thing. Sometimes we have to build the strength or the endurance or the speed or whatever it might be. Any other thoughts around varying the speed of vibrato and how that can be useful? All right, the second layer of the box, or sometimes with younger kids, I just do a square, is the size of the vibrato. So for this exercise, I generally leave the metronome at a set pace because I don't want to, I am trying to consciously separate the different dimensions of vibrato. I'm going to try to keep my dynamic mezzo forte throughout, but I'm going to change, and I'll think triplets just because triplets is where my comfort vibrato practice is. Starting subtle. And then moving to like more higher peaks and higher valleys. Give that a try and see how, and you might try, that was 86 for the metronome. You might try it slower or faster depending on wherever's comfortable. Keeping the speed of the vibrato steady, the dynamic steady. See if you can change just the size of the vibrato. What are some things that you observe?
I observed that it's difficult. It's difficult once you, okay, I'm not sure it's whether it's my ear not hearing it or whether it is that hard, but I find as I speed up, I automatically, what's the word? Make it less deep, make it becomes more shallow automatically. And I'm in my head thinking, oh, I'll never be able to keep it wider as I go faster. So it's intimidating.
So far, okay, any other thoughts?
I would assume that if the note you're actually playing in the music is pianissimo or piano, then obviously the vibrato would be proportionately very small. Whereas if it's a forte note you're playing or a FF, then you can have a wide vibrato on it. So obviously it will change with the dynamic of the actual musical notes you're playing.
That's an excellent observation. That's what I came off mute to point out, right? Is that the amplitude or the depth of the vibrato has to be, within reason relative to the volume at which you're playing. Otherwise, the peaks are too intense, and the troughs, you can actually lose your sound. Like the sound will cut out on the low parts.
Yeah, the way I read it
contributes to that like billy goat sound that some people get.
Yeah, the way I read it with Emily Benyon's video, I think, was that the vibrato needs to be within the note and not go outside it. And I think that's a way of saying the same thing. You need to stay within the actual.
Let me just ask, are you trying to say if it's pianissimo and it's a long held note, I can't do no, I can't, but you wouldn't be doing a large depth, a big depth in the note? Really?
Yeah, I think commonly, and I don't want to think of this as a limitation, but that is absolutely how I would think of it. Louder notes, I think there's more room for variety in the size of your vibrato. Softer notes, it can cancel out. So in my students' music, I draw this very often, where if they're vibrating too big through a decrescendo, then it does just kind of cancel out their sound. So I draw the upper one to remind them to try to keep the vibrato within the sound. And that's just something that you can maybe play around with. So like maybe what's going to create the bigger waves of vibrato, Daniel, at a softer dynamic might be larger pitch bends type of a thing. So
that's what I meant. That's what I meant. The pitch bends. That's what I was confusing. I'm sorry.
No, it's great. No, this is a great question.
No,
I think it's
both dimensions. There's the volume, which is the amplitude dimension of the vibrato.
Right.
And then there's the pitch bend dimension of the vibrato.
Yeah.
Personally, I conceptualize it more as a volume, an amplitude than a pitch bend, but you can use both. Some people, there are both elements to it on flute, not like violin where it's pretty much all pitch bend.
Like I know specifically some pieces with long held notes that at the end of the piece that are, piano, where I have used a larger pitch bend in them because they're long held notes. I was thinking that was, that's a no-no, but it sounds like it's not a no-no.
So there's more possibility. There are more right ways to do things than wrong, but generally speaking, you've got to keep I guess be aware of the way that you're creating vibrato. Is it canceling out your sound, right? And if your vibrato is mostly created by a dynamic change, then you've got to fit it within. Or look for a style of creating vibrato that is less dynamic change and more pitch change kind of a thing, if you want to do that.
Or
So far,
or if you're in the upper part of the range, you have more flexibility too, because you kind of need a wider vibrato to make it audible to the audience when you're in the higher range than when you're in the lower range. So lots of variables.
so many
The other
variables.
thing too, though, with vibrato is that you've got to realize, and I'm speaking mainly from an orchestral experience, but also in a chamber music experience with either a string quartet or piano or whatever, you've got to blend with people. You've got to blend with different sounds. Clarinets often don't play with vibrato. Oboes, bassoons do play with vibrato. French horn usually does not play with vibrato. So you've got to take into consideration also, who you're playing with. And then you can vary your speed and width and depth of vibrato based on who you're playing with, right? So at the beginning of maybe the Beethoven Leonore Overture number 3, I'm not going to use a super wide vibrato because, as Joe was saying, right, we're at a piano dynamic. It's a long held note going into these sort of stepwise quarter notes in the scale, and you just want to create this feeling of just suspension of the sound. So if I add a really active vibrato onto that, I'm going to stand out in a way from the rest of my colleagues that everyone's going to be like, oh, that's kind of untasteful, right? So just knowing and having that control over the vibrato in different dynamics for the context of who you're playing with is also very good to just be aware of.
Yeah, and the way that strings create vibrato versus winds create vibrato, there's going to be different variations in that kind of blend too. Thank you for reminding us that part of connection is the ability to connect with other musicians when we're performing an ensemble or performing together. Good. So far we've covered 2 of the dimensions of vibrato, which is all we're going to talk about today. We've covered size, if it's barely noticeable or very big. And we've covered speed, if it's slow pulses or fast pulses. Now, when you think of just those 2 things separated, it feels really quite basic. But look at that palette that we've created. If we can play slow, small vibrato or fast, small vibrato, then we have a whole strip of creativity that we can do. If we are playing big vibrato, slow or fast, we have a whole strip. And if we think of all of the variations from just those 2 dimensions, then we have a whole lot of vibrato opportunity at our fingertips. And so with that in mind, in these last bit, I'd like to talk to you all, have you all talk to me about applying it to the repertoire that you're working on right now. So are there places, I think that we've got the Berceuse, the Kohler Berceuse, which has so many lyrical lines and then a little middle 16th note section and then a return to just lovely lyricism. And then maybe thinking of the Barcarola and the Gobert suite as places where you might think about how you're going to apply vibrato practice, as something that you're intentionally considering opportunity or options for. So just a quick show of hands, who is working on the Kohler right now? And how many of you work on the Gobert? And how many others, I guess? All right, so would anybody like to play a phrase from whatever it is that you're working on right now, and then we can talk about vibrato in that phrase. Nobody specifically?
Okay, I'll do it.
All right. Thanks, Annie. And
But
what are you looking at right now?
I'm not looking at it, it's just by memory. So just the first line of the Doppler fantasy,
Sure.
because the first note is a fascinating one for this conversation, for me anyway. Well, I have to do the original sound.
Thank you.
audio settings. Original sound for musicians. So on. Yes? Yes.
We won't know until you play. But yes, on.
Can you hear it? I'm sorry. Maybe somebody should go through. I've got it checked off, so I don't understand.
Well, let's look at
Somebody
just
should.
a phrase of both pieces then. So let's start with the Kohler. If you're able to pull up the Kohler Berceuse. Let me quick type the IMSLP link in the chat for any of you who aren't currently working on that. Oops, I wanted to go to everybody and not just Daniel.
Oh.
Hopefully that works. I've already opened the file, so it might get stuck. And yes, you have to wait 15 seconds. All right, so I just pulled this piece up today. It's not, I haven't been active in that group, so I haven't looked at it yet. But it does start off with this like lovely line, lovely looking line. Etc. Does everybody see that line? Now we have choices as a musician. Also, one of the things we didn't talk about is the choice to not use vibrato. In a piece like this, I oftentimes hear students not use vibrato unintentionally. And to me, if it's an unintentional not use of vibrato, it sticks out. And what I mean by that is, most often the case is the student will use vibrato on the longer notes, but not on the smaller notes or the shorter notes. And then those notes to me stick out as a choice that is interrupting from the musical expression or the musical line. Observations on that? Have you noticed that in your own playing or in other people's playing? Is that something that you've heard? Does it bother you? Does it stick out to you, or does it feel comfortable?
I used to get that comment sometimes when I was performing or playing in a lesson for someone. One of my teachers used to call it on-off vibrato, where certain notes have vibrato and certain notes don't get vibrato. And I think it sounds more musical that way, but it can actually be really, really distracting from the musical line if certain notes get vibrato or don't get vibrato in that way, or the speed is different or something like that. So it is very valuable to practice your phrasing without the vibrato and then see where, as we're saying, it's another tool to add to your phrasing where it might enhance certain notes within the phrase.
Mm-hmm. Alternatively, if I gave every note the exact same number of beats of vibrato, it could sound very mechanical. So I'm going to give each eighth note triplet vibrato. Now, to me, nothing really sounds wrong about that. Just nothing sounds very natural or right about that for me. But I was also really trying to think about it. So listening to the comparison of vibrato on some notes versus strict vibrato on every note, what do you all notice?
The strict vibrato is less musical, but that's kind of
Less
by
musical
definition.
than no vibrato on short notes?
Yeah.
I thought also the constant vibrato on every note also sounded really heavy to me. There was no lightness about it. It was just like constant, and it was just bombarding in terms of the variation of, I couldn't really sort of focus on where I was in the point of the phrase.
Mm-hmm.
And
I guess I also was over exaggerating by triplet because that wasn't a piano dynamic. I was doing big old triplet vibratos just to try to be mechanical. Now, what if we, I don't know, what if we did make this math for a second and do 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 E and a 4 triplet, 5 triplet, 6 E and a. So on the eighth notes, trying to put in 4 quavers while we're doing triplets on the quarter notes. How would that sound? Just exploring. This isn't a suggestion, but what would it feel like? Sometimes speeding up the vibrato on a short note to help lead to another note, I think is a very useful thing of it. But doing it between in the phrases felt awkward to me. What did it sound like to all of you? I'm not asking you to like anything I'm exploring with you all today. It's just faster for me to explore it than ask you to. What's that, Joe?
In certain places, it keeps the line moving, but I'll get out of the way so Joe can.
Oh, sorry. Let's do Joe first, then Sean. Joe?
Yeah, I was going to say the latter sounded much better than the strict. With the strict vibrato, it sounded almost like there was something going on separate to the music. It was not part of the music. It was like something extraneous. Whereas the latter method, at least it sounds more musical.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe to my ears, because I don't do vibrato myself, to me there'd be too much vibrato there and it would be distracting. I think the vibrato should be there without you noticing it, I think.
Yeah, and right now I'm over exaggerating vibrato for sure, but a general statement, yes, I agree with you, Joe. Sean, what were you gonna suggest?
I was just going to say, you know, when you put it on the shorter notes and you increase the frequency, then it helps keep the phrase moving forward, right? It generates a sense of momentum, but done too much, then it just sticks out, right?
Again, this isn't a one rule gets applied to every situation type of a thing. Just wanted to explore a couple of options with you all. Now, I would like to demonstrate, just for fairness, the opposite, where I'm doing faster vibrato on the longer notes and shorter vibrato on the short notes, just to see what it sounds like. All right, and in comparison, what do you all notice? What do you think?
I think it sounds very delicate.
That time I also played more delicately, but it felt more delicate too to have the vibrato present but less intense on the eighth notes.
Yeah, it felt more delicate. Yeah, I think it just felt more delicate.
Mm-hmm. All right, did everybody get it?
Lower. It didn't drive forward as fast. It didn't have the same energy to it.
It felt more delicate but less forward pressed. Any other thoughts about just hearing my demonstrations of what things could be with that? Can everybody take a second and try a phrase, whether it's this same phrase that I demonstrated or a phrase of whatever you're working on, and try using vibrato in 2 or 3 or 4 different ways, and then tell me what your experience is from that. Go ahead, Daniel.
I wasn't going to say anything, but I can. I find it counterintuitive to speed up on the shorter notes. My tendency is to speed up on the longer notes. I'm not going to comment on which I like better or not, but it will be a real exercise to try to do that. an awareness of using vibrato in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Options, right? This isn't a do this. This isn't a this is the right way. This is I just want to explore making our tone palette, our painting palette bigger so we have more options. So when we make the choices consciously or subconsciously, because if it's happening subconsciously, it's still a choice that you're making. You're the body making the vibrato. That you have more options for that. Other thoughts or observations of trying to do faster vibrato or shorter vibrato on shorter notes or longer notes?
I think this is a good piece to practice the changing your vibrato on. It's not too fast, it's nice and lyrical. You've got notes of different lengths, so you can figure out where the boundaries are. And yeah, this is a good example for that kind of practice.
All right, let's just do some just general thinking out loud. All right, or thinking quietly. One thing I'd like to do is everyone take 60 seconds and type in as many descriptive words that you would sometimes use for notes that you put vibrato on. So like, I don't know, for example, sometimes I'm like, oh, this vibrato is rich, or ooh, this vibrato is shimmery, right? Think of all of the different words that you've ever used to describe tone or vibrato or a note, whether it's a short note or a long note. All right, now I'm just going to read these back. All right, let me scroll up to the top. Spinning. All right, so spinning vibrato. Unmute yourself and tell me, what do you think about with spinning vibrato?
Spinning vibrato for me is really just a way of reminding myself not to go outside that boundary that we were talking about with the diagram. And to also just think about, it ties in actually to resonating, to really think about how the air inside of this tube is reacting and resonating, right? So the air is creating our sound, but if we spin that, or if we think about that speed of the air resonating in the tube, there's going to be some sort of spin in the sound. And also then when we can vary that speed of the vibrato and all of that. So that's my way of really making sure that my vibrato is really tied into my sound and my color and not exceeding in whatever dynamic range that sort of boundary of ugly, I think.
Mm-hmm. Good. Anybody else have experience with using the word spinning in their flute vibrato? My teacher would talk about spinning often, but usually it was spinning to remind me to keep the note going forward to the next note or to the rest, like spin through kind of a thing. So that was a word that was used in my lessons a lot as a youth. Let's see, Daniel has resonant, emotive, intense is what I can see right now. Anybody like to talk about any of those three words while I'm scrolling?
When I say resonant, I mean, it's a way to make sure that can be a way to make sure that your sound is having an impact on the listener, that they're really receiving the sound.
That the intention of the sound is communicating through or connecting with the listener. I like that.
That's
Resonates
right.
with them. Intense, ringing, singing, dramatic are some words from Sean. Would you like to talk about any of those words, Sean?
I think those are different words of the effect that I might try to achieve with the vibrato.
All right, in that case, how would you make an intense vibrato? Like, what would you think? What is a
For an
characteristic
intense
of the note?
vibrato, I'm going to use, we haven't talked about shape of the wave yet, but for intense, I would use more of a sawtooth vibrato shape and with a more intensity, right? So sawtooth, you've got your pulse and then a sharp decline. So as you do that, it gives an intensity to the sound, at least in my perception. And then the ringing and singing vibratos are more sine wave, where you're a little, softer on the downslope, right? And then the dramatic ones, those are more still sine wave, but a wider, more intense, and then changing the frequency on the held notes, especially on the releases.
So the third concept that we didn't cover today in my vibrato box, again, this is just me, is shape of vibrato, which Sean was just talking to. And so it can be a little bit more pointed or sawtooth, or it can be a little bit more smooth or sine wave. So if you think of sound in its physics form, you'll notice those. The more sawtooth tends to be with for me, more of a contraction and then a release. And then the sine wave tends to be more of a imagination of air pressure change in this area, is oftentimes how I'm feeling the physical changes of the shape of my vibrato. Sean, is that similar, or have you noticed any experiences when you're changing the shape?
I think my engineering background leaks out, and I did spend a good chunk of time studying the physics of music, as part of my undergrad program. So
I love it.
That's where that terminology comes from.
Freedom, warm, resonant, rich, colorful, lyrical, fulsome, from Joe. Joe, would you like to talk about any of those words and what they mean to you?
Yeah, as I don't do vibrato myself, never learned it, even though I did the grades in music. It wasn't even ever mentioned, funny enough. So I'm now going to start trying to do it. So those words there are what I hear when I listen to the great players like Emmanuel Parhud and James Galway and guys like that. James Galway in particular has an incredible resonant, rich vibrato sound. Even though I think James Galway uses vibrato in Baroque music, and I believe that's a mortal sin. That they say that Baroque music shouldn't have vibrato, but my goal would be to try and bring in vibrato and get that richer sound, basically, get more resonant, more musical, basically.
Some of my words, rich, for me, rich tends to have bigger amplitude, bigger size. Shimmer tends to have smaller size. Cavernous is like rich, bigger, but usually a little bit slower. Passionate tends to be kind of big to me, but fast. Spinning tends to be moderate to small and fast. Subtle vibrato would be very small and just a moderate tempo of speed. Powerful, again, big. Dramatic, big and fast, usually like my Mozart divas. Sorrowful, it depends. Sometimes I go with a big pitch bendy vibrato to make it sound like I'm really sad, like like trying to emulate the feeling of of crying. If you listen to somebody cry and you hear the pitch bend down when they're doing it, emotional, painful, delicate, reflective vibrato. To me, a reflective vibrato is going to be more along the subtle lines. So there's some variations there. Cynthia typed in sparkle, shimmer, velvety. Cynthia, would you like to talk about what any of those mean to you?
Sure. When you gave this assignment, of course, I was trying to separate the adjective for the vibrato that wouldn't be the adjective for the tone, but that's impossible. Is it? I mean, because we're applying it to our tone. So I think, well, with velvety, just having a more openness and wider vibrato is what I would go for, and then you get that, which would then lead to a richer tone. But sparkly and shimmery, I think of water and the surface of the water and the sunlight on the water, which is what we're applying to musically, sound wise, we apply to the sound, and just trying to emulate that in such a lovely way. So either way, we're trying to enhance, and those were the three that I came up with.
Yeah, and then Lily typed in resonant, passionate, volume, and depth. Would you like to talk about any of those and what they mean to you in your flute playing?
Well, I don't really do vibrato, but then when I listen to people play vibrato, I feel they're more they have more volume, and then it's not like flat. It's like, if I don't have vibrato, it sounds like very single-minded. But then if you have vibrato, it's more volume and then more passionate, more musical. So
Yeah,
that's what I think about vibrato.
I love it. And it definitely does help us shape phrases and helps us create line and direction and movement, which are great things. So I, as that managing mind of mine, I like to personally practice things sometimes very separated. So if I'm looking at a piece of music and I'm writing in my notes, this part is passionate for me. One of the things that I want to think about is what can I do to make it feel or sound passionate? And then I like to practice those separately. So if in that passionate section I think, oh, I want to play louder here, then I'm going to step back from the music and practice playing loud with good intonation, right? Or if I want to play with really fast vibrato here, then I'm going to take just a second away from music and play some fast vibrato things to feel the mechanical separation for me. And then I can come back and apply it to the music in just a second. So has anybody ever looked at your piece of music and thought this needs to be really sad or this needs to be really thoughtful? And how would my vibrato sound if I were being sad or if I were being reflective or if I were being these personality traits? Is that a layer of practice that you often take a step to do? Yes,
I,
no. I know I like to over micromanage too many things, I'm sure. Daniel, we're about to say something?
yeah, I'm just gonna say because of my background in directing and acting, um, I find it for myself easier to think of a storyline than
Mhm.
it is to be like if you ask somebody to be sad, it's harder than to say, you're in a hospital room and your mother's dying, and then you can be that person. So I might say this area needs to be sad, but then I try to come up with a storyline so that I can do that.
I
Uh,
love it.
and then I can now thinking, oh well, if that's what it is, then this is the vibrato I'd like to use for that, like a third step almost.
I love it. And to be perfectly honest, what I said a second ago isn't exactly the truth for me. I like to practice my vibrato box so I have the tools ready to go at the same time that I'm doing my warm up with my scales and my dynamics and things like that. But I do like to practice it as its own practice. And then when I come to the music, I'm ready to apply the technique and the dynamics and the expressive elements. So,
But I think what I'm trying to say is I agree that's cool. And so, but how do you, I guess out of this, what I've been confused about, not confused about the challenges, well, how do I choose what kind of vibrato I want to use all the way? And now when you say, well, what mood do you want to create? And if I say to myself, what storyline do I want to be? Then it seems that the choice of the vibrato can flow from that, as opposed to this note, that note, the quarter notes being sped up, that blah, 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 right? Do you get what
right? Yeah. And you know I love storytelling too. So Daniel is one of the greatest storytellers. So take a chance and listen to him tell a story and then hear him play some flute too. Other thoughts about how you might like apply vibrato speed and size to your practice or to the music that you're playing before we let everyone go to bed or wake up or eat lunch or dinner?
I think a really easy way, if everybody is aware of the Marcel Moïse long tone exercises from De La Sonorité, is to just simply follow that trajectory of the exercise where you go chromatically down from B, which he calls, the best note for us on the instrument because we're not just venting the instrument completely open. But to do that exercise of what we were talking a little bit about today, just straight tone first to find the core of the sound, and then to repeat the exercise of the long tone by adding vibrato into it, and then working your way down, and then working your way up from there. So it's really, about finding the center of the sound first, and then, as we were saying, vibrato is a tool, right, that we have in our toolkit. So finding speed and all the things we were talking about today, but applying that to your exercise of long tones. Marcel Moïse has already done that for us. So by just going right to your exercises and applying that daily in that very easy, short way, those take about 5 minutes to go through all the way down and then all the way up with repeats. So it's not a lot of time, and you can really just focus on that one aspect of your flute playing.
It might be 5 minutes, but it sure feels like 25 to me. I don't know about anybody else. What other thoughts about how you might apply practicing speed and size of vibrato, or if you will, if that seems like it's something that's going to be useful for you in your music practice? All right. Seems like we're coming to a place where we can say thank you, everybody. It's been great to spend my morning and whatever time zone you're in, that part of the day with you. If you ever have any questions, of course, feel free to ask them either directly to me or into the group. This is a place where we come together to learn together, right? To connect, and that can happen in so many different ways, and we want to keep doing it. Thank you again to Flute World for encouraging this group to continue to connect in groups like and things like this group practice as well. And I hope you all have a really wonderful day or night. Sleep well, Lily.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you.
Bye.
Very
Thank
useful.
you.
Namaste.
Great job, Matthew.
Hey, thanks for being here, Sean, as always.
Take care.
Thanks, you too.